So welcome. I am Danielle Miller, and I'm the Director and Regional Librarian at the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are presenting this program here at the Talking Book and Braille Library from the traditional lands of the Coast Salish peoples who have stewarded this land for generations. And this presentation that you are about to enjoy is part of the Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau program. And we also bring you this presentation as part of our year-long celebration of the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library's 90th anniversary as a network library of the National Library Service for the Blind and Print Disabled of the Library of Congress. And we are really excited to have a presentation that has a real connection that has to do with our work and readership here at the library. Today we have From Radio to the Smart Speaker, How Sound Transmission Changed the World, and all the audio that we do here, that is such a great connection. And so this is with Ross Reynolds, and Ross Reynolds is KUOW's executive producer for community engagement, before which he was a program host for 16 years, and his awards include the 2011 Public Radio News Director's first place in the call-in category for living in a white city. And in 2015, he was named to the University of Washington Communication Alumni Hall of Fame. And most of you, I believe you should have come in muted right now, and it would be great if you could remain on mute during the program. I know we'll have time for questions and comments at the end of the presentation, and you can use the raise hand function. If you're on your computer, that's down at the bottom under the reactions. If you're on your telephone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. If you're unable to do either of those things, you can unmute yourself and say your name, and then I will call on you, and I will repeat that when we're at the end. So we're really excited to have you, Ross, and why don't you go ahead? I'll turn it over to you.
Well, I'm really excited to be with you all today, and thank you so much for taking the time. My email address is rossray@gmail.com, and if we don't have time to connect at the end of the presentation, when I'll do a Q&A, feel free to write to me. I'd be happy to talk to you more about this subject, which I am passionate about. I've worked my entire adult life in audio, in public radio. I've been at KUOW for 34 years. Before that, I worked at KBOO in Portland, Oregon, and I began my career in Worcester, Massachusetts at WCUW. Danielle mentioned some of the honorary things that I have and some of the things that I've won, but my most cherished credential is that I am an honorary seafarer pirate, and my pirate name is Rotten Ross. As I mentioned, I've been fascinated by the power of sound forever. Garrison Keillor has this great quote. He once said of television, "It's all contained in a box, while radio is as big as your imagination." In 1963, radio people felt threatened by television. Radio was thought to be dying. The comedian Stan Freeburg made an advertisement for radio.
Too bad about radio.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, since television, you know, hardly anybody listens to radio anymore.
Oh, I wouldn't worry about that if I were you. There's a radio in use for every man, woman, and teenager in America.
Really? Gee, I'd hate to think of them all turning them on at once.
They do. Every morning.
Who listens to radio? That go where you go medium called radio.
Radio? Why should I advertise on radio? There's nothing to look at, no pictures.
Listen, you can do things on radio you couldn't possibly do on TV.
That'll be the day.
All right, watch this. Okay, people, and now when I give you the cue, I want the 700-foot mountain of whipped cream to roll into Lake Michigan, which has been drained and filled with hot chocolate. Then the Royal Canadian Air Force will fly overhead towing a 10-ton maraschino cherry, which will be dropped into the whipped cream to the cheering of 25,000 extras. All right, cue the mountain. Cue the Air Force. Cue the maraschino cherry. Okay, 25,000 cheering extras. Now, you want to try that on television?
Of course, the joke is that today, television and movies with CGI, et cetera, can easily create Lake Michigan filled with hot chocolate and a maraschino cherry on top, or the destruction of Los Angeles in an earthquake, or a Paris street rolling over itself like it did in the film Inception. But there's still something unique about just hearing sounds and voices that taps into our imagination in ways that the visual stimulus does not, something very personal. That's because, as media theorist Marshall McLuhan famously said, the medium is the message. And by that he meant the way the message is conveyed can be just as important as the message itself. Radio, books, the internet are all different media, and each medium shapes us in different ways. We create communications media, and by using those media, they affect us. TV and internet are what Marshall McLuhan called hot media. That means they contain a lot of information. A hot medium saturates your senses. Audio is what Marshall McLuhan would call a cool medium. It provides no visual information, just sound. And our mind was work harder to create the pictures. We create the images that we imagine from sound. That's why books on tape can be so effective. You create all those images in your mind. Let me give you an example. You've been listening to my voice for a couple of minutes now. How do you imagine I look? You get one guess. In this presentation, I'd like to talk about sound that we're not present to hear, sound coming from places out of earshot. I'll talk about the history of broadcast sound transmission from radio. I'll talk about online podcasts, appliances like smart speakers that don't just talk to us, but interact with sounds that we make. They listen and talk back. And the more I'd like to focus a lot on how voices and sound particularly affect us in a very different way than any way else. Here's an example from the New York Times radio show and podcast, The Daily. Last year, The Daily asked people to talk about the best thing that happened to them during the pandemic.
This is Chris from Fuquay Arena, North Carolina. In 2017, me and my wife got married, and that following year, in spring of 2018, we started to try and have a baby. And there were quite a few roadblocks that we encountered, fertility specialists, so on. And this Monday, I came downstairs to head to work, and my wife was at the kitchen table with a positive pregnancy test. It's the world to me. It's honestly really made this year worth it. We are both so happy and so thrilled. We just can't wait to have a family.
Hi, this is Leslie Kretz, and I live in Milton, Ontario, Canada. And the best thing that happened to me this year was the birth of my son, Nathan, on February 10th. So he's 10 months old today.
My wife and I welcomed our first son this year.
We welcomed twins in February of this year.
I had a baby girl.
A baby boy.
We welcomed our first baby.
Our first child.
Isabel.
Lucy May.
Sophia.
Maeve Lillian.
Enuma Elish.
We called him Goose for short.
Can you say anything?
Hey, this is Will from Western Massachusetts. I'm a doctor out here, and unfortunately we've had to quarantine from most people because of that. And things have been really difficult this year, like they have been for lots of people. But at one point, right when I was getting ready to go to work, about 6:30 p.m., I'm a nocturnist, and my wife's feeling frustrated and a little lonely, totally understandably. Our daughter, who's, I don't know how many months old at that point, but a little over a year, just decided to stand up and walk across the living room for the first time. And it was like this magical being from another universe just kind of like entered the house and became ambulatory. And we both started tearing up, kind of laughing hysterically. It was like this kind of tear in the fabric of our day-to-day life that was so welcome.
I've heard that piece of audio a couple dozen times, and it never fails to affect my emotions. And in this presentation, I'd like to talk to you about how transmitted audio from somewhere far away, has affected you, and I'd like you to kind of participate in this. Imagine how magical it must have been to talk on the phone to someone for the first time. They were far away, yet they were right there in your ear. And telephones show us the magic of audio. Phone calls have changed my life and probably yours. I was in a phone booth, remember them? In 1980, when the people from KVOO in Portland, Oregon, told me I had a job as the news director. I was on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. And that one phone call meant I'd be leaving the East Coast, never to return to live. So think about phone calls that changed your life, calling someone for a first date, a phone call from our doctor. My wife calls her brothers every week. She says, as soon as they say just a few words, she knows instantly how they're feeling. And as amazing as the phone was and still is, it's just one phone to another phone, and you need a wire to connect them. In 1920, mass media arrived. Behold in all its glory, the mahogany Philco music radio cabinet carved in a wooden case. That forest scene that's in the middle there, if you look closely, is needlepoint. In the early days, radios were treasured pieces of furniture everyone would gather around. This was the early 20th century equivalent of a luxe screening room with a 100-inch TV and surround sound. The first broadcast radio station went on the air in 1920, so we just celebrated the first century of radio. All at once, you could communicate to masses of people instantaneously. Radio collapsed space and time. It was so new, there really wasn't a word for it, so they appropriated a word from agriculture. Broadcasting was originally a term for spreading seeds, but over just 26 years, you can see that it changed to become the definition of airwaves, carrying news, entertainment, live events. It's difficult to imagine today the impact radio had on the world. It was simply a wonder. People thought it was magical to hear voices from other places, and it sparked the imagination of everyone who encountered it. Radio was the first medium to connect masses of people across huge geographic areas all at once. Many realized the power of being able to reach a large audience simultaneously, and everyone wanted to figure out how to use it. It was like a gold rush. Eric Barnow, in his History of Broadcasting, wrote, the story of early radio involved statesmen, mountebanks, teachers, salesmen, artists, wheeler-dealers, soldiers, saints, reporters, propagandists, and others. Who would control this powerful medium? What would it be used for? People believed in the power of radio to create social change in much the same way that early disciples of the internet felt it would connect and unite us and change the world. Politicians recognized that the control of radio was a means of social control. In many countries, radio was a state-run service. In liberal democracies like Great Britain, you got a respected service like the BBC. In Nazi Germany, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels led the charge to create a radio cheap enough that even workers could own one. Most of the revolutions of the last century began with seizing control of the radio station. Unlike other countries, in the US, private businesses controlled radio. Broadcasting became an advertising medium. It's also difficult to imagine today when all media are saturated by ads, but it took a while. It took several years in the 20s for business people to realize that if you touted a product, a service, or an idea on radio, it moved people. And it took a while for radio station owners to understand they could sell airtime to those people to make a buck. So how do you get people to listen? You put on the radio the biggest stars of stage, screen, and music to pull in the audience. And when you got people's attention, you could sell them ads and make a fortune. In its heyday, radio had the power of TV and the internet together. Radio was the mass medium. Radio helped to spread jazz, classical, and country music across the country. Musicians like Artie Shaw, Marian Anderson, Hank Williams, and Charlie Parker were already known for their recordings, but radio brought them live into your living room. Imagine listening from 42nd Street in some distant area and hearing Charlie Parker playing live. Radio comedy and drama became the primary entertainment, spelling the beginning of the end of vaudeville. Orson Welles, seen here on the right, played the Shadow, Lamont Cranston, in 1937 and 38. He co-founded the Mercury Theater. And in 1938, they did a radio adaptation of War of the Worlds. They wove fake news bulletins into a music show. Many were fooled into believing creatures from Mars were invading. And during World War II, radio took on a new role as a trusted news source. Edward R. Murrow was a revered newsman. He became a national figure, broadcasting live from London rooftops during the Blitz in World War II, vividly describing searchlights scanning the skies for Nazi bombers. Murrow did a blistering expose of Senator Joe McCarthy that helped to end the Red Scare. Murrow attended college at what became Washington State University. And at WSU now, as many of you might know, there's the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication. The arrival of television beginning in the 1950s changed radio. As you heard Stan Freeburg say at the beginning, there was this fear that radio would wipe out, the TV would be wipe out radio. But it didn't happen. Radio just evolved. The big stars of the day did go from radio to TV, but radio created their own stars, DJs and talk show hosts. Radio stations played to the medium's strength, music formats, news, sports, and talk. And radio became hyper-local. In the Midwest, radio stations broadcast commodity prices and detailed weather reports for farmers. In urban areas, traffic reports became vital. And everyone listened for the weather because kids, not that long ago, you could not look up the weather instantly on your phone. Imagine that. Then in the 1960s, a new form of radio became available. I haven't played Steely Dan's FM here, but if you get the reference, it's already planted in your head, which also shows the power of radio to lodge itself in your mind, the power of audio. This new technology that came online was FM radio. The broadcast signal had a much higher quality than AM, but because few people had FM radios, commercial interests were slow to adopt FM. That meant that radio frequencies were readily available. Universities and colleges grabbed them up. College stations broadcast the schedule of educational radio, professors lecturing classical music. In the 1960s, the cultural uprising around the newly empowered youth generation, protests against the Vietnam War, and the surge of rock and roll culture was the sound of what became known as underground radio, like this station from Boston, WBCN. In the early 60s, there was a reawakening of interest in radio's largely untapped potential to spark change and enlightenment. It helped lead the youth movement, and people began to consider if radio could do more than entertain, if radio could do more than sell things. How could it be a public service, creating and serving an informed public? And in that spirit, in 1967, President Lyndon Johnson and Congress created a funding mechanism for public media. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting funds public media. The original draft of the legislation funding public broadcasting was only for TV, and at the last minute, a handwritten section was included to the bill, including funding for public radio. This is an actual screenshot of the picture. Originally, it said Corporation for Public Television Broadcasting. They scratched out television and just made it the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and that allowed it to fund TV and radio. National Public Radio was created in 1970, partly with those funds. By the way, NPR no longer stands for National Public Radio. It's just NPR because it's not only a provider of radio, but also web streaming and podcasting content. The first broadcast was live coverage of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations Committee hearings on the Vietnam War. All Things Considered came on the air in April 20th of 1971, 50 years ago. And this is just a taste of their first broadcast.
Thousands of young people came to Washington willing to risk being arrested in order to end the war. They went into the streets this morning to stop the government from functioning by clogging many Washington roads during this morning's rush hour. For many demonstrators, the mobile street tactics of civil disobedience are an expected spring event. But before today, many other young people who came to Washington had not been willing to oppose the state with their bodies. For these young Americans, today was a major test of their commitment to the ethical code of the young and the angry. It was their freedom ride, their Selma March, their May Day.
Stop the war now! 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 Stop the war now!
A line of young people has just come across the highway. Traffic is stopped. Now here come the police. 1, 2, 3, 4 police on motor scooters. One demonstrator knocked down by a motor scooter policeman. Anger now. Anger of the young people.
Motor 3 on the Southwest Freeway. Have one injured down here. Could you send me an ambulance, please? It's right at Main Avenue.
And he hit the kid. It went right through the line.
Past me and almost knocked me down. And a blue...
Yeah, but it's policeman we're talking about.
Motorcycle.
Policeman.
Motorcycle hit him.
Not a citizen. Right there. The man over there. Right there.
Sergeant, excuse me, Jeff Kamen, National Public Radio. Is that a technique where the men actually try to drive the bikes into the demonstrators?
No, it's no technique. We're trying to go down the road and the people get in front. What are you going to do? You don't stop on a dime.
I don't know about you, but when I listen to that, I can see the motorcycles, I can see the crowd. It kind of summons up many visual images in your mind. Terrestrial radio relies on a radio tower. AM radio stations require not only big towers, but lots of land around them because of the way the AM signal goes out. You need a stick to broadcast. But in the 1990s, satellite radio from the upper atmosphere became available. The first satellite radio broadcasts were in Africa and the Middle East back in 1999. That's because it was hard to put up sticks all over those places to broadcast to people. The first US broadcasts were in 2001, dominated by Sirius radio, satellite radio, and XM satellite radio, and they later merged. Next innovation in audio transmission that dominates today is over the internet. And that chapter begins right in Seattle. Rob Glazer left his job at Microsoft to found Progressive Networks. His original goal was to provide distribution channels for politically progressive content. But what caught on was not the political content, it was the distribution of audio via the internet in a technology known as streaming. Glaser pivoted to streaming technology and rebranded as Real Networks. It was a breakthrough technology, the Real Player. Suddenly, the computer could provide audio. It was scratchy and it was glitchy, but the computer could talk. As computers and internet connections got faster, audio quality improved rapidly. One of the earliest internet transmitted events was a baseball game between the New York Yankees and the Seattle Mariners back in September 5th, 1995. Besides listening live, audio over internet technology allowed you to download an audio file and listen to it at your leisure. It was the audio equivalent to a video cassette recorder that allowed you to record TV shows and watch them at a convenient time. Listening was untethered from time, and the podcast was born. The first podcast, October 2003, a weekly musical talk show hosted by Matt Schichter called The Backstage Pass. Guests included B.B. King, Third Eye Blind, and the Beach Boys. Then in June 2005, Apple released iTunes 4.9, and that made it easier to find and download podcasts, not just to your computer, but also to your phone. Now, if any of you were born in 2014, that's an important year to remember in the history of audio transmissions for two reasons. The first is that in 2014, this podcast launched the mass podcast movement.
This is a Global Tel-Link prepaid call from
Adnan Sayed,
an inmate at a Maryland Correctional Facility.
From This American Life and WBEZ Chicago, it's Serial, one story told week by week. I'm Sarah Koenig. For the last year, I've spent every working day trying to figure out where a high school kid was for an hour after school one day in 1999. Or if you want to get technical about it, and apparently I do, where a high school kid was for 21 minutes after school one day in 1999. This search sometimes feels undignified on my part. I've had to ask about teenagers' sex lives, where, how often, with whom, about notes they passed in class, about their drug habits, their relationships with their parents. And I am not a detective or a private investigator. I'm not even a crime reporter. But yes, every day this year, I've tried to figure out the alibi of a 17-year-old boy.
Over the next 12 one-hour episodes, Sarah Koenig walked us through the evidence step by step. It told a compelling story, and Sarah Koenig became a character herself, walking through her doubts and research. The series ended up getting Adnan a review of his case. Syria was a huge success. That first episode in early October 2014, but within a month, Syria was the fastest podcast to reach 5 million downloads. By the end of December that year, it had been downloaded 40 million times. So what was it about the sound of Serial and podcasting that attracts people? It really is a new way to present audio information, and it creates a new listening experience. Rebecca Mead wrote in The New Yorker that great podcasts presented an audio narrative that can be immersive in a way that radio playing in the background rarely is. Podcasts are designed to take up time rather than to be checked, scanned, and rushed through. So if you're not familiar with podcasts, you're not alone. 45% of Americans have never listened to a podcast, but that number is dropping rapidly. There are 800 million people listening to podcasts. By 2025, that number will more than double to 2 billion. The number of podcasts is also increasing astronomically. As of December 2020, Apple hosted 1.68 million podcasts. Here are some of the most popular. You'll notice many from public radio, The Daily, NPR News Now. You'll notice some commercial ones, Dateline, NBC. Ben Shapiro and Daniel Bongino do conservative talk radio shows. CNN's in their Radio Lab. Daniel Ek, the boss of Spotify, the audio streaming service, says audio, not just music, is going to be the future. In fact, Spotify started a podcast hosted by Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Podcasts are a boon to anyone who wants to reach a large audience directly. Instead of working for a radio station or at a radio network, you can create something with a personal voice. You can talk about stories that fascinate you, with the potential to connect directly to a worldwide audience. In some people broadcast podcasts have really replaced radio listening. They just tune into podcasts. It's pretty easy to podcast if you know the basics of broadcasting. A microphone, a computer, a high-speed internet connection, an audio recorder, digital audio editing software, good internet connection, and you're good to go. The ease of podcasting has increased the number of users and it's led to everyone and her sister starting a podcast. If you're a celebrity, chances are you've been on podcasts or you have your own podcast. Anyone interested in anything from bird calls to politics to knitting to true crime to music can find multiple podcasts by people who share your obsession. There are an estimated 2 million podcasts and over 48 million episodes. Now, you might remember I asked if anyone was born in 2014 because two important things in audio history happened that year. The first was podcasts, but also in 2014, Amazon launched a brand new kind of device, the smart speaker. It's great to have devices that talk to you, like radio and podcasts, but in 2014, we got devices that talk back. Voice recognition is now integrated into smartphones too. Instead of texting with your thumbs, you just talk. Instead of typing in an address on Google Maps, you just say it and the app will respond. The smart speaker responds to questions and commands with answers and actions. There are smart speakers from Amazon, Sonos, Apple, Google, and others. I've got one of Amazon's. It's that hockey puck in the lower right-hand corner of the picture called Alexa. What's a smart speaker?
According to Wikipedia, a smart speaker is a type of speaker and voice command device with an integrated virtual assistant that offers interactive actions and hands-free activation with the help of one hot word. Some smart speakers can also act as a smart device that utilizes Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and other protocol standards to extend usage beyond audio playback, such as to control home automation devices.
You can ask a smart speaker anything. Alexa, what is Humanities Washington?
Here's something I found on the web. According to crew.edu, founded in 1973, Humanities Washington is a nonprofit organization funded through private contributions and National Endowment for the Humanities matching grants.
They're called smart speakers, but they're not always very bright. Alexa, what does Humanities Washington do?
I don't know that.
Yeah. Technically, smart speakers are always hearing, but the makers say they're not listening to your conversations unless you use the wake-up word like, okay, Google, or hey, Siri, or Alexa. How many people have smart speakers in the US?
Not exactly, but I offer no resistance to helpful assistance.
Okay. Smart speaker adoption has been really going rapidly. It's quintupled in just the last 2 years. A marketing firm estimates that about 18 million smart speakers were shipped in America in the fourth quarter of 2020. But still, 2/3 of Americans don't have a smart speaker. And one concern is privacy. Hey, Alexa, when do you listen?
I'm designed to protect your privacy, so I record audio only after your device detects the wake word, or if the action button is pushed. On Echo devices, you'll always know when your request is being sent to the cloud and recorded, because a blue light indicator will appear or an audio tone will sound. You can learn more by visiting amazon.com/Alexa privacy.
Well, despite her reassurances, over just 1 year, the percent of people moderately or very concerned about smart speaker privacy has gone up sharply. My wife is wary about when that little hockey puck is listening. And there is reason for suspicion. In 2017, Google Home Mini saved recordings at times when the wake word wasn't used. In 2018, Amazon Echo sent private audio recorded in the home to someone on the owner's contact list without permission. And in 2019, Amazon admitted that thousands of its employees were listening into recordings made on its smart speakers and transcribing what they heard. It's a real basic equation, convenience versus privacy. Despite the concerns, convenience appears to be winning, with sales rising rapidly. So I'm really interested in hearing from those of you who might be using those kind of smart speakers. And at this point, I'd like to open up the floor to your questions or your comments. I'm particularly interested in several questions as a radio guy. I'd really like to know what radio stations you listen to and why. Does what you listen to now change from when you were a teenager? Is there something on radio you've heard that's really stayed with you forever? I'm also really interested in whether you listen to podcasts or books on tape, which ones and what about them attracts you? And I'd like to know, do you talk to your phone instead of using your thumb? Do you use a smart speaker? Why or why not? And Danielle is going to be sort of the call screener at this point to help us through your questions. And if you have any other questions or comments, one thing I learned from doing talk radio for about 16 years, that there was always someone in the audience who's smarter than I am about about the questions that I'm talking about. So you might be that smarter person. Please jump in with your question or your comment.
Thank you, Ross. That was fantastic. And I see, Chris, you have your hand raised. There was one question in chat before you, so I'm going to take that first. And just a reminder, raise your hand. And if you're on the phone, it's *9. You can also put your questions in chat. Ross, Rita had a question. Why are podcasts called podcasts? Do you know the answer to that?
That is a great question. And that's a perfect example of the audience knowing more than I do. Maybe someone else out there knows how they got the name podcast. I don't know the answer to that. I'm very sorry to say. I will definitely research that for the next time.
Okay. Okay, Chris, go ahead. If you're unable to unmute yourself, Chris. Or do you need me to unmute? Can you unmute yourself, Chris?
I got a shock one time when I was talking to someone about podcasts, and he told me that that replaced his radio listening. I mean, for radio people, it's a little threatening to think that podcasts are going to be diverting listening away from your radio station, particularly for a listener-sponsored radio station such as ours that really relies on listeners who not only listen, but also call in and financially support it. We have Chris here.
Yeah, Deb, why don't we go to you, Deb Cook Lewis?
Hi, Deb.
Are you guys unable to? Go ahead, Deb.
There, now I did. Yeah,
okay.
There's a prompt if people are trying to unmute. There's a little prompt that's coming up that you have to respond to first. It's kind of weird.
Okay.
So I was just going to comment about the podcasts, where they come from. They come from the iPod. The original notion of Apple was that, you know, this would be the device that you would play them on, was the iPod. And so the thing that you play is the podcast. And that's actually, I was doing some work for Apple at the time, and that was the terminology they were pushing forward.
There.
Ah.
Now we know.
Thank you, Deb. Okay. And Chris, are you able? I am having trouble unmuting people for some reason. So how about Frank? Are you able to unmute?
Yep, looks like it.
Okay.
Zoom is not a very nice platform. I find it very, very frustrating sometimes, and usually unnecessary for small groups like this. I like to listen to internet radio, like the Ride show that, or the Ride, not more than a show, the Ride programming that Deb and Rick put on. I also listen to radio reading services.
What is the Ride?
Radio reading services for the blind. Pretty much you got on the internet. There's about 18 or 20 of them now that you can, listen to it. I've got them all programmed in, and I can jump around between them. I listen to NPR on Saturdays usually. Scott Simon, and I listen to mostly the podcasts that I listen to are technical, usually having to do with the iPhone or assistive listening, or not assistive listening, is accessibility for the blind, yes. That kind of thing.
That's kind
but
of.
I listen a lot. Yeah, I listen a lot to the things that are on the internet and on the radio.
They can be so specific, Frank, which is so interesting. Every tiny interest and large interests are all kind of addressed in podcasts. That's what's kind of amazing about it. A radio station would not necessarily put on shows that are like podcasts because they're trying to appeal to a wider audience, whereas podcasts are just from the creator directly to the person who's listening to it. So that's kind of a great opportunity for them to do that.
Frank, do you want to mention ACB Radio?
Well, and ACB Radio, yes. The now has 10 channels, and the big part of it that people are really getting, it's also gone into the I can't think of the new thing. That anyway, but what the biggest part of it is the community programming, and there are hundreds of community oriented shows that go out. And I like to listen to the technical ones, but there's ones on crafts, and there are ones on self improvement and just social, very social things where people talk to each other and help and support each other. There's entertainment, there's those games and discussions about everything under the sun.
What is ACB?
And I've been doing the karaoke and the open mic as well. What?
What does ACB stand for?
Oh, American Council of the Blind. It's a national organization that we're a member of. Okay. But they really jumped into this with both feet, and it's probably the thing is growing our organization more than anything else right now, because so many people are so interested in this way of communicating. And of course, it came along at a very opportune time with the pandemic, and people were isolated and really wanted another way to get together. And now it's just growing and growing.
Yes, it's definitely attracting a lot of people to that kind of listening. The radio audience is declining, actually. It's going down as more people find these alternatives. And the technology of streaming has really changed what it means to even do radio. Since anywhere you're getting an internet signal, you can be streaming. It sort of broadens it incredibly. You can listen to radio stations all over the world live, if you like them, by listening to them over the internet. It's kind of a great technology for spreading audio.
The other word I was trying to think of was clubhouse. Okay. And I've just jumped, not really in with both feet. I have a toe in right now, but it's interesting. It's very interesting.
Okay, thank you, Frank. So let's see. I know Bennett had a comment, and I want to get back to the chat. So Chris, are you able to unmute? Chris?
Let me see if I can unmute Chris.
Yeah, maybe since you're the host, maybe.
I should
so
have
you know,
power,
Barb,
shouldn't I?
there too. I don't know whether it makes a difference or not, because I don't know what I'm doing.
I'm sorry, Chris, I can't unmute you. Anyway.
Bennett, can you go?
Yes, am I unmuted here?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, good. I thought so. Yes. This is very interesting, Ross. I came from Portland, Oregon back in the 70s, late 70s, when KBOO was just getting started. And I've enjoyed public radio ever since. But the thing I was interested in talking about a little bit is the history of sports broadcasts on radio. Bob Blackburn and others did a bunch of wire-recreated ball games at one time, where they actually didn't go on the road with the teams until TV started sending its folks to the actual games and so forth. But what they would do is they get a report from the baseball field every inning about what happened in that inning, and then they would have to make up a game as they went along. And the reason I mention this is because the more things change, the more they stay the same. During the pandemic, the radio and TV broadcasters didn't go to many of the fields either. They stayed home, and they used the sound from piped in fan noise and other things to make the game sound just as exciting as it would have been if they'd been in the actual stands and so forth. And I thought that, so the more things change, the more they stay the same.
That's right. I remember watching the NBA finals to the empty, not this year, but last year, and you could hear the sound, but there were no people in the audience. By the way, that method of broadcasting sports games, that was how Ronald Reagan got his start in media. He would get a wire service of what was happening, and he would kind of make up what was going on the field and broadcast it on radio. That's how he got started.
I remember one quick story. I remember when we on the radio ring service were interviewing some people. I interviewed Bob Blackburn towards the end of his career, and I asked him about what in the wire recreation games was a good story. And he said one time he was doing a football game by wire recreation, and he signaled to his engineer that he wanted the sound of people. I'm sorry, they were doing a baseball game, and he motioned to his engineer that he needed the fans to cheer real loud because of a home run. Mm-hmm. And he hit the pencil on the microphone and said, "Swung on, there's a ball deep to left field. It is gone, home run." And he pointed to the engineer, and the engineer turned on the cheering sound and it went, "We want a touchdown. We want a touchdown."
Oops.
Yeah, press the wrong one. But there's all kinds of stuff like that in the history of radio.
And it's also tells you how powerful radio media is and was. I related the story of the War of the Worlds, which many people know, that scared a lot of folks. Yeah. When I was on the radio in Portland, I did a show one time. I was doing a show and I decided I'd like to try something else. So I found a whole bunch of audio of a river bubbling along, and I lay it under my voice for each show. And I would come on the air and I would say, "Well, this summer I'm broadcasting from a raft on the Willamette River." And I would kind of proceed to do the show saying I was on the river. And I was amazed at how many people called the station and said, "Where's that raft that Ross Reynolds is on? I want to go see him."
You got a raft about it all, didn't you? Yeah.
Thank you, Bennett. So we've got quite a few things in chat, and if anyone else wants to raise their hand, go ahead. Cindy B says she listens to BBC journalist Ben Hammersley from The Guardian. And Sarah White says, "I only listen to the actual radio in the car, the same station I listened to when I was a teenager, and they often play the exact same music too. Haha. And when I was a kid, I listened to Kid Star, the Seattle station just for kids. They used to play audiobooks at night, and I'd listen to them before I fell asleep. My friend did their birthday party at the Kid Star station. They also had a big interactive component. You could call in and record answers to questions, and they'd play your responses on the radio. I remember they played my response once, and I was so proud of myself. My husband loves listening to the Mariners on the radio. He sometimes prefers listening to sports to watching them on television." And Cindy B says, NPR now and WBZ Boston Top 40 as a teen. And Lindsay says, "I haven't listened to the radio in years, but I do listen to a variety of podcasts. My favorite murder, Mysteries Abound, This Podcast Will Kill You, On Purpose with Jay Shetty, and Vibe Higher Happier." Richard Saunders says KUOW, of course, some KNKX, commercial radio for some back and forth discussion, especially humorous. Yes, podcasts and books on tape, can take them anywhere, out to the yard, in the car, on the beach. Mostly uses thumb with the phone, but some talking to. No smart speaker, doesn't need any more technology. Neil McKay says, as a kid, listened to KVI 570 AM back when there were quirky DJs like Robert E. Lee Hardwick. They also played old radio shows from the 30s and 40s every night, which instilled a lifelong love of radio comedy and drama. Later, it was KJR, Channel 95, also AM radio, Casey Kasem's Top 40. As an adult, I listened to CBC Canadian Broadcasting System, also AM radio. Great shows. Most of them are also podcasts. Kelsey Smith says, "I listen to the radio in the shower, usually Mix 96, and sometimes in the evenings after work, KAOS, Chaos. I listen to more audiobooks than podcasts, mostly because I don't have time to listen to both." Beth says, "Love streaming radio. I put up with the static on KOW in the San Juan Islands for years, but now that I stream, I can hear the radio without a super long antenna in my kitchen and no ability to hear anywhere else in my house." Richard says, "Still loves baseball on the radio." Chris Coulter, Chris, I'm glad we are getting you. Thank you for typing in the chat. I'm an avid podcast listener. I started in 2009 when I was healing from a broken ankle. Podcasts have become more and more immersive each year, and I love them. I'm interested in being on my own podcast. Leanne says, I remember hearing that Elvis was dead. I was a young child and my mother started crying into the kitchen sink. I also remember first hearing the coverage of 9/11 on NPR. My husband had gotten up to feed the cats at 5 a.m. as usual and came back to wake me to listen. So there's a lot there.
Yeah,
Ross.
I mean, all the folks listening to podcasting, and I like Sarah's comment about only listening in her car. The dirty secret of public radio is we love traffic jams because people listen in their car a lot more. It's for a lot of people, our most listened to times, as they are for most radio stations, are morning drive and afternoon drive. And that's because people are commuting to work and they like radio to entertain themselves. So the podcasting changeover is really something radio has to deal with. KUOW is working on couple of our own podcasts. One is called The Wild. It's by a wildlife expert, just trying to figure out a way to get into that space. And I'm glad someone gave a shout out to my favorite murder, which is a guilty pleasure podcast. If you haven't listened to it, it's two women discussing their favorite murders, exactly that. I don't want to even describe it anymore, but if you listen to the first 15 minutes, you'll either be hooked or you'll never listen to it again.
I know I listen a lot I listen to KUOW on my phone when I'm gardening. I have it in my back pocket and listen when I'm out in the yard. That's one of the times I listen.
I mean, the radio, since it's live, does have that ability to tell you about what's happening right now. Someone mentioned hearing that Elvis was dead on the radio. And of course, for many of us, hearing John Lennon was dead was something we heard on the radio for the first time. But then usually we run right to our TV because we want to see the pictures.
Yeah. Les Fitzpatrick, you've got your hand up. Can you unmute yourself?
Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Yes. All right. Well, no one has talked about talking books very much. I listened to my first talking book, I believe it was in 1958. I've also a long-time subscriber of the Radio Talking Book Network on the little receivers that we got that were using an FM frequency, I forgot what they called it. The
SCA.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that was pretty interesting. There was a lot of good reading on there. And I just wanted to say thank you, Ross, for your presentation. And I couldn't believe I was trying to do a Control Y to raise my hand. It used to work on Zoom, but it doesn't now. So it took me quite a while to find out where to raise my hand. But anyway, I got it. So I just wanted to comment about all that. And I do listen to podcasts on a Victor Stream or Victor Trek. And I've listened to a lot of really good podcasts as well.
Les, thanks so much for your comment. We had a really interesting discussion in my last presentation about listening to books on tape, and a literature professor weighed in on it. She said her students are doing a lot of that. And we had a little discussion about whether listening to a book is the same as reading a book, because when I read, certainly when I'm reading heavy tomes, I stop and I reread a sentence to kind of absorb it a little bit more. But you can't, of course, do that when you're listening to a book, and it's a little bit difficult to index it. So I asked the literature professor, I detected in her voice a bit of uncertainty about allowing her students to be listening instead of reading. And she said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Are you okay with that?" And she said, "Oh yeah, I listen to books on audio all the time too." So she didn't have a problem with it. But I'm kind of curious, if you have any thoughts, Les, since you do a lot of it, is the experience of listening to a book, do you think it's the same as reading?
Yes, I do think it's the same. As a matter of fact, I've got a carrying case from my Victor that I just clip it on my shirt collar, and it's right by my ear, so I can turn the volume down low. And it's really easy just to hit the back button and go back just a few seconds. So if I hear something, I think, what did she say? Or what did he say?
Mm-hmm.
The back button and listen again. And so, yeah, I do that.
And we do put a lot of metadata in the books, so you can navigate pretty well through the books to get to different spots. And yeah. And we've got a couple comments here kind of in reaction to that. Cindy says, I love to listen to memoirs, books on tape read by the author. And Neil says audiobooks from the library, and most podcast players have a player that allows you to back up 15 seconds. Yep. And Cindy says the only thing you miss is the family photos they include in their paper editions. So I have to get those later.
Well, I'd really like to hear if any of you are using smart speakers, and if so, how much you're using them, because there is a lot of uncertainty about it. Probably a lot of you are just using the voice commands on your phone. That's certainly an easy buy-in, but the idea of having a smart speaker listening can be kind of nerve-wracking for folks. And I'm wondering if any of you, I think one of you mentioned that you used it, but it was kind of a novelty. Any thoughts that you have on smart speakers?
I can't get my hand raised. Can you hear me? And I'm interrupting, and I'm sorry.
Barbara, please go ahead. Yes.
I don't mean to interrupt. So if I'm doing the wrong thing, just somebody fire me later.
No, you're fine. Please go ahead.
I have several things that I want to say. Yes, I have smart speakers. I've got one new one that's giving me a fit, and I've got to call the company about it. But Jensen, a company called Jensen, oddly enough, because I'm one of those crazy home shopping persons that watches TV and buys stuff, they have a little AM FM pocket radio that they're selling with a little antenna that you can carry around just like we did when we were teenagers, if you want to, which I think is hilarious. As the gentleman said, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yes, that's true. I remember when I was a kid, it was like you always wanted more transistors. If you had a 16 transistor radio, that was okay. But if you had a 25 transistor radio, that was so much better. It's sort of a status thing. And I noticed that Sarah White has written to say that she has a smart speaker, and it's a really nice way to listen to music. And I understand that a lot of people are using it that way, just to be able to shout out the song you want to hear and have it play automatically.
I do that.
Yeah, that's pretty handy.
I listen to KBOO on Saturday mornings for the Bluegrass Show. And yes, that makes me a little strange, but that's what I do with it.
Oh, Sarah also wrote to say that her favorite thing about a smart speaker is that you can ask for the animal of the day. Let's try that. Alexa, what's the animal of the day?
Here is your animal for August 18th, the black vulture. The black vulture soars high while searching for food, holding its wings horizontally and gliding. Here is a black vulture scream.
I kind of love the randomness of the smart speaker. It can really answer a lot of different things, but then some things it's completely clueless about. It's like some very brainy person you're hanging out with, and they just pop off with odd information, but then you ask them something very basic and they don't have a clue.
I have one more question, then I will mute myself and go away and just listen.
Sure.
Would you please explain what terrestrial radio is again?
Terrestrial radio is AM and FM. I mean, there's also other types of terrestrial radio, but unlike it, the signal emanates from a radio tower. And AM is a different sort from FM. It's the kind of bandwidth that they use. AM radio, actually, the reason they have a lot of land around an AM radio tower is the signal actually goes down and bounces up into the upper atmosphere. And FM, you kind of need to have line of sight. That's why KUOW's antenna is up on Capitol Hill. So some folks who are kind of down below and don't really have line of sight to Capitol Hill have a hard time listening to it. So terrestrial is AM, FM, and satellite is from the sky.
Okay, because we have one here in Camas that is terrestrial, and I'm thinking, what are they talking about? Now I know. Thank you very much. And I've enjoyed this broadcasting a lot because I've done broadcasting back in the 60s at the University of Delaware when we had closed circuit transmitters in all the dorms. And now they're finally on, I believe, FM. It's WHEN. But I wish we'd had this course or part of this course when I took my broadcasting course, because it would have told us a lot more than I learned. And I learned a bunch there and I learned a bunch here, and I want to thank you.
No, you're very welcome. I got my start in college radio also, which is a whole other topic. We can get into that about how college radio got many people involved in it and how that led to community radio and how that led to public radio. It was kind of a straight line.
Thank you, Barbara. I just want to check, Bennett, Frank, do you have another comment or question, or are your hands still up from before? If you have anything you want to comment or ask, please go ahead and unmute yourself.
This is Bennett. Very quickly, I didn't mean to keep my hand up, but as long as I got the opportunity, I will say this. One of the things that throughout the history of radio is the real help of amateur radio. I've been a ham radio operator for many, many years, and
yes,
they have always been on the cutting edge of different audio and the way people transmit and function. So I think that is another course as well.
Yeah, I know there's so many facets to this. I didn't really even talk about ham radio. Remember CB radio? Someone mentioned at a certain point I should talk about ship to shore radio, which also is a whole different way of transmission. There's a lot here that I was not able to get to in this short presentation.
So no, it's been a great presentation. I didn't really have anything else to say. I was just muting on my little podcast board here, and I didn't mute it in the software, but I can lower my hand.
Oh, thank you, Frank.
I don't know how, so you just have to figure that I'm gone.
I do have another one real quick.
Oh, please, Les, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't know how to, I didn't want to go through trying to raise my hand again. I'm also an amateur radio operator, been since 2005, I think. And I just got my radio set up again here where I live now, and I've been enjoying listening to the Alaska Morning Net and some different things on the Echo Link repeater that links radio stations all over the world. And that's pretty interesting.
Great. Any other final thoughts or questions or subjects people would like to throw out? I put back up on the screen my email address. I'm happy to correspond with you after this if you have further comments or questions.
Would you spell it out loud?
Yes, ROSSREY, Ross Ray @gmail.com.
Thank you.
And there's a comment here from Neil. There's a great podcast about podcasts, speaking of meta, absolutely, called How Sound. That's all together, capital H, capital S. It has helped me immensely as I've put together a podcast for our library system. And he's got the URL there. So thank you for sharing that. And David says, great work, Ross. And I think this has been fantastic. And we've just got about a minute or so left if anyone has a final comment. And Ross, thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
I had a really good time. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is a subject I've got a huge interest in. And thank you for educating me about the origins of the name podcast and many other things that you were able to share.
Okay, applause.
And Chris says thank you also. I think this has been great. And again, we have recorded this. We'll probably have a link to this up tomorrow or by the end of the week on our website. And thanks to Ross for being open for further communication from everyone here. And I think I will reclaim hosting. That may bump the presentation off. Let's see. Nope, I think we're okay. And I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you everyone for coming so very much. Appreciate you all.
Danielle, thank you for making it so easy.
Oh, good. Yes, absolutely.